One of the things I do really want to ask about is how post COVID homeschooling has changed, because I think that woke a lot of people up to the fact that school is not meeting children's needs or helpful or even the safe choice anymore. So I'm curious what, because I've talked to people who have done homeschooling for a while, and the questions were always sort of the same of like, well, how do you do it, and what's your curriculum, and I wonder if those questions have changed post COVID. So I'm curious what you've noticed before that, the things that people were curious about, and what you're noticing now. How has COVID changed the questions around homeschooling or unschooling?
Dramatically so. Yeah, dramatically so. I mean, this has been a year of education transformation. I don't think we're ever going to go back to kind of education as usual. I think that's a good thing. For the most part, parents have been re-empowered. They've been put back in charge of their children's education in ways that were unimaginable pre-pandemic. Beginning last spring, these parents all of a sudden, through much disruption and a great bit of challenge, were able to see up close what their kids were actually learning in school or not learning in school through the pandemic-related Zoom schooling that many districts and independent schools launched, and that continued over the past year. And I think for a lot of parents, it was a real wake-up call that maybe, this isn't the best educational environment for their kids. For example, I have a neighbor who decided to homeschool this spring. And she was the wheels started turning last spring as a result of the school closures, where she discovered that her child's teacher was reading a book to the class that her child herself had read a couple of years prior. So just even that kind of more intimate look at what was happening in the classroom, I think, was a real wake up call for a lot of families, and they were able to kind of start to think about education beyond their assigned district school. I think the other thing was that parents were maybe thinking about homeschooling in the past, but sort of lacked that catalyst to make it happen. Maybe they were never really satisfied with their child's schooling, but they, didn't sort of have a trigger to exit until the pandemic enabled that to happen through the school closures. And they said, "Oh, now is my opportunity." And so I think a lot of parents seized that moment to pull their kids out of school. And also, I think parents really became frustrated even throughout the 2020-2021 academic year as school closures continued in many places. And parents just said, this remote schooling is not working for my kids. I need something better for them. And so they continually pulled their kids out throughout this current or just ending academic year, to the point that the U.S. Census Bureau came out with data in February showing that that more than 11% of U.S. K-12 students are currently being homeschooled this academic year.
Wow.
And that's a more than tripling of pre-pandemic homeschooling levels based on other federal data from the U.S. Department of Education, suggesting that about 3.5% of the U.S. K-12 school-age population had been homeschooling. So we went from under 2 million homeschoolers pre-pandemic to now more than 5.5 million homeschoolers this academic year. Most of the growth, interestingly, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, was coming from families of color, in particular Black families that saw a five-fold increase in homeschooling rates from the spring of 2020 to the fall of 2020. Just dramatic increase. In fact, now an overrepresentation of Black homeschoolers in the homeschooling population compared to in the K-12 public school population. There's now more than as I said, 16% of today's homeschoolers are Black homeschoolers, compared to 15% of Black students in the overall K-12 public school population. So just tremendous growth. And I think parents really realizing that they can do better. They don't have to be the ones doing all of the teaching. This sort of gets back to your earlier question about sort of the difference between homeschooling and unschooling, or what is unschooling. And it really challenges this idea that, you have to be sitting around the kitchen table, going through a bunch of textbooks or a prepackaged curriculum, kind of our stereotypical view of homeschooling. With unschooling, and in particular now, so many of the technological resources available to families choosing a different learning path, a parent's role really is much more about connecting and facilitating learning than it is about doing the active instruction. And so I think a lot of families realized that this was more feasible for them than they otherwise might have thought.
I like that frame of that you're facilitating it. And I guess it goes back to the question of like, how is it that children actually learn? Because I think very often when people have a question about homeschooling, there's like implied in there the idea that you're schooling, and all of the assumptions that people have around schooling come up, as opposed to, what do kids actually need and how do they learn? Because I know as an adult, when I want to learn something, I don't always sit in a room with someone talking at me for 45 minutes straight. I do a whole bunch of different things. So how is it that children actually learn, and how is it that you as a parent, especially with so many people who are new to this, how is it that you facilitate that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's such a good question. And one of the things I touch on in the book, Unschooled, which I should mention came out in the spring of 2019, but actually had far more interest, a renewed interest throughout 2020, in the spring of 2020, as schools shut down and parents suddenly were looking for resources of how to do this, how to live and learn alongside children at home. And one of the things I talk about in the book is that, it used to be that parents would send their kids to school because that was where the books were, that was where the knowledge was, that was where the teachers were. And of course, for us now in the 21st century, all of that is around us. And I think, and I make the point that you've made as well, is look at how we as adults learn, how we continue to, pursue knowledge or discover new skills and interests. It's very often through community networks and technology. And we are able to sort of pick and choose our instructors and pick and choose our classes, and find mentors and members of our community to help us. And so a lot of it is just extending that same freedom to learn to our children. And I think, again, another real breakthrough from the coronavirus pandemic, as devastating as it's been for so many families, is it's encouraged more families that and more employers to embrace working from home. And in fact, the Brookings Institution came out with a research paper just finding that, working from home is here to stay, that many companies are going to continue to embrace either hybrid work schedules or remote only work schedules. And so I think as parents discover that they may have more flexibility than ever before in their work, that they're not tied to sort of a 9-to-5 schedule in an office building 5 days a week, that they'll want to extend that same flexibility in learning to their kids.
Thank you for listening. If you like this clip, please subscribe and share the show with someone else who would also like it. You can find the Brendon Marotta Show on all major podcast platforms and at brendonmarotta.com/show. Thanks again for listening, and I hope to share more with you in the future.